The oppressive, musty air of the desert clung to the truck as we rumbled down the dusty track. The setting sun painted the desolate landscape in hues of decay, a silent harbinger of the horror that awaited us. "Do you think he's all right?" Eveline's voice was a shaky whisper, laced with anxiety. "He's not well, Josh. You know that." "Maybe the radio's just busted," I offered, attempting to reassure her, but a cold fist of dread had already begun to clench around my own heart. "Don't go thinking the worst." My father, a man of stubborn, paranoid conviction, had sealed himself away in his doomsday bunker at the start of 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic began. He'd always believed the world was on the brink of collapse, that anyone who didn't share his views was brainwashed. We tried to reason with him, but it was no use. My memories of him were confined to tense weekends spent in the stifling confines of the bunker, where he tirelessly reinforced walls, stockpiled supplies, prepared for the end. He hadn't been a good father, or even much of one at all, but the thought of him dying alone in his delusion filled me with a hollow sadness. The last contact we'd had was 3 months ago, a garbled message crackling over the old ham radio. He'd found a hidden door, he said, and he was going to see what lay beyond. There was an unsettling fervor in his voice that had left me deeply uneasy. Now, as that unease curdled into a chilling certainty, I wished I'd done more to stop him. Night had fallen, swallowing the vast expanse of the desert in its inky maw. My father's truck sat under a tattered tarp, a desiccated carcass in the barren wasteland. We grabbed our flashlights and trudged towards the bunker entrance, concealed beneath a rocky outcrop. "Dad? Dad, are you in there? It's Josh. Eveline's here too." My voice echoed unanswered into the stillness, met only by the mournful sigh of the wind. The heavy steel door was built to withstand a nuclear blast. It was a stroke of luck that I'd held onto the only spare key. Before using it, I pounded on the metal, shouting for my father, hoping he wouldn't mistake us for raiders and start shooting. "Dad, we're coming in." The stench hit us the moment the bunker door creaked open, the smell of death. It brought back memories of my father's ill-fated attempt at deer hunting, the carcass left to rot for weeks. Eveline covered her nose with her shirt, her face pale. Darkness swallowed us as we descended the spiral staircase. Rusted metal groaned ominously with each step, as if threatening to collapse beneath our weight. I fumbled for the light switch, but it was no use. The batteries, charged by a clunky bicycle-powered generator, were long dead, which meant the generator must be out, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but the tremor was unmistakable. "Maybe. Why don't you wait here, just in case?" I shone my flashlight ahead. The weak beam barely penetrated the oppressive darkness of the long corridor that led to the living area. A primal fear, the kind that lurked in the shadowy corners of childhood nightmares, began to stir within me. "I'm not letting you go in there alone." Eveline's grip on my arm tightened, her voice tight with fear. "We stick together." We stepped into the darkness. The stench intensified, mingling with the frantic thud of my heartbeat. The bunker, so much larger in my childhood memories, now seemed to press in on us, a distorted echo of its former self. A faded Confederate flag, its colors leached by time, materialized in the gloom at the end of the corridor. It hung on the bare concrete wall like a specter from a bygone era, or perhaps a corpse resurrected. The irony of a man who preached so much about freedom, hanging a symbol of oppression on his wall, Eveline muttered, her voice laced with disbelief. He wanted his freedom so bad he built himself a prison, I said, averting my gaze from the unsettling banner. He was delusional. The main living area opened before us, a tableau of squalor and decay. Empty cans and bottles littered the sticky floor, the air thick with the stench of rot. That's strange. Eveline shone her flashlight on the small dining table. Look. The hair on the back of my neck prickled before I even registered what she was talking about. The table was set for 3. Who else was here with him? Eveline breathed, her voice barely a whisper. We don't know that. I tried to sound rational, but my voice sounded thin even to my own ears. Maybe he just left the old plates out and... A loud crash from one of the rooms deeper in the bunker cut me off. I swung the flashlight in that direction, but the beam was swallowed by the impenetrable darkness. Dad, I called out. It's Josh. Are you in there? Only silence answered. I'm scared, Josh, Eveline whispered, her grip on my arm tightening. Something's not right. My attention was drawn to something on the far wall. That shouldn't be there, I murmured, moving towards it. This has to be what he was talking about on the radio. A section of the concrete wall had been smashed open, revealing a rusted metal door. It hung ajar, a cold, musty draft emanating from the black void beyond. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. Eveline tugged at my arm, begging me to leave, but I had to know what lay beyond that threshold. Oh, God, Eveline breathed, peering over my shoulder. What is that? Beyond the door was a small room, no bigger than a closet. It was bare except for a circular opening in the floor. I shone my flashlight down, but the beam was swallowed by the abyss, unable to find the bottom. Do you think he fell in? Eveline shuddered. A bead of sweat trickled down my temple, disappearing into the unseen depths. I felt a wave of dizziness, stumbled back, afraid I might be pulled in myself. Eveline picked up a dented can of beans, tossed it into the hole. It clanged against the stone, the sound echoing down, fading into an unsettling silence. It never seemed to hit the bottom. It's warm, I said. The air. The air coming up. Maybe he did fall. Eveline stepped back, her voice tight. Can we go now? We can come back with the police. Please, Josh. It was daylight when he found this place, I said. He would have seen the hole. Josh, please. Just let me think for a second. I walked towards the corridor leading to the other rooms, hoping to find my father. For some reason, seeing him, confirming it, felt vitally important. You're just... My words died in my throat. My flashlight beam had landed on something in the middle of the hallway, a pair of legs, sticking out from the shadows. I think I found him. I ran towards the body. Wait, Eveline cried out, reluctantly trailing behind. It wasn't my father. The scream tore from my throat before I could stifle it, my mind unable to process what my eyes were seeing. I turned to run, but collided with Eveline. She clung to me, and as she saw what stood behind me, she started to sob uncontrollably. Oh, God, she choked out, her voice ragged. How is that possible? It's you. The decaying face staring back at me. It was mine. A bullet hole gaped between the eyes. We scrambled back, knocking over chairs, sending cans clattering across the floor in our haste to escape. As we were about to break free from the nightmare, a familiar voice echoed from the back of the bunker. "Josh," my father. We both froze. "Is that you, son?" "Josh." "Dad?" I called back. "What the hell is going on?" "Don't worry." The voice was coming from deeper inside the bunker, from the direction of the storage room. "I got the bastard, shot him right between the eyes." "Get out of there," I yelled. "We have to get out of here. It's not safe." Silence. "Something's wrong," Eveline said. "I don't think—" "Dad," I screamed, "get out here now. I can't move." My father's voice was a strained whisper. "The shelf. It's on top of me. Help me, son." I looked at Eveline. "He needs our help." The chilling plea echoed from the shadows, laced with an otherworldly urgency, sending shivers down their spines. "The shelf. It fell on me. Josh, help me." Josh stood rooted to the spot, the stench of death clinging to the air, suffocating him. The image of his own lifeless face, eyes staring vacantly, was seared into his mind. Fear, a monstrous entity, tightened its grip on his sanity, squeezing the last vestiges of courage from his chest. "Josh, no." Eveline's voice trembled as she clung to her brother's arm, her face ashen in the flickering beam of the flashlight. He shot himself, Josh. Look." She pointed towards the end of the hallway, where their father's body remained slumped on the toilet, blood pooling around his head. A blood-soaked journal clutched in his lifeless hand. "But he's calling for help," Josh stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The world around him seemed to tilt on its axis as his gaze drifted back to the gruesome sight in the middle of the hallway. His own lifeless form sprawled on the floor, head twisted at an unnatural angle, blood splattered on the walls. How is that even possible?" Josh mumbled, his hand instinctively reaching for the blood-soaked journal that had slipped from his father's grasp. The words, scrawled in a frantic hand, jumped out at him, each stroke a searing brand against his sanity, revealing a truth too horrifying, too illogical to comprehend. It wasn't Eveline. It tricked me. God help me. It tried to kill me." Josh felt a coldness seep into his bones, spreading through him like a virus. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to escape the suffocating confines of the bunker. But his feet felt like lead weights. "Josh, let's go." Eveline's voice pierced through his daze, and she pulled her brother with all her strength, dragging him towards the exit. They scrambled out of the bunker, leaving behind the chilling pleas echoing in the darkness. Inside the stifling confines of the bunker, bathed in the fading light of the flashlight, their father's body sat motionless, a grotesque parody of a smile etched on his lifeless face. We drove away from the bunker as fast as the truck would take us, leaving behind the chilling pleas echoing from the darkness. Eveline insisted on staying at my place for a few days. I didn't argue. We had shared something horrific, something no one else could understand, and we needed each other to make sense of it all. It took me a full day to work up the courage to open my father's journal. It began with the familiar ramblings about conspiracies. I flipped through them. It wasn't until the last few entries that things took a turn. Found a hidden doorway. Deep pit. Maybe some kind of Black Ops relic. Eveline and Josh woke me up. A surprise visit. Didn't hear them come in. Strange. Having dinner with them. Something's not right. They're not them. They're trying to get me to illegible. God help me. They're not them. I shot the bastard right between the eyes. Hiding in the bathroom, this might be my last entry. God forgive me. A chill ran down my spine as I read the final line on the blood-stained page. I couldn't get the other one. It's still out there. Only one bullet left. Won't let it do that to me. Forgive me. Eveline had been cooking for hours. She called out from the kitchen. "Josh, dinner's ready. You're going to love this." A shiver ran down my spine, leaving a trail of goose flesh in its wake. A sense of unease, cold and sharp, coiled in the pit of my stomach. A feeling I hadn't been able to shake. Not really. Not since. I looked down at my hands. Blood. My hands were covered in blood. My sister was a genius. At 13, she built a device that, to this day, I still don't understand. I've spent my life studying physics, and I still don't understand what she did. And maybe it's better that way, especially given how it all turned out. All I know is that in the summer of 2003, the laws of physics and atomic mass no longer seemed to apply to her. She became invisible to the naked eye, and the language she spoke was an uncanny, discordant symphony beyond human comprehension. Before I go any further, have you ever seen the show Firefly? Allow me to quote a passage. "I'm really very intelligent. I went to medical school at Osiris, top 3% of my class, finished my internship in 8 months. Gifted, they called me." So, when I tell you that my sister made me look like a dull, normal boy, I mean that she was precisely that much smarter than me. This passage could have been written about me and my sisters. My family has a history of being exceptionally bright. My father was a neurosurgeon, my mother worked for SpaceX, and my older sister was a celebrated artist whose work had been featured in prestigious galleries since she was 12. I myself am a high-energy physicist at a university I won't embarrass by naming. And much like Simon Tam in Firefly, I'm not telling you this to brag or imply that I'm special. I just want you to understand what I mean when I say that Neurali made all of us look like dull, normal children. In 2003, I was about to turn 17. My idea of fun wasn't like other teenage girls, so I won't bore you with the details of what I found more interesting than TV, books, or the mall. But suffice it to say that I was almost always preoccupied with personal research projects. The first time Neurali went invisible, I was neck-deep in a particularly vexing scientific paper. They're wrong, you know? Neurali's sing-song voice startled me from behind. I groaned under my breath. We'd had a serious conversation about knocking, but it never seemed to stick. "Neurali, what did we talk about regarding knocking?" "Oh." Her voice held genuine surprise. "I forgot about the door." "What?" I frowned, turning in my chair to face her. The room was empty. Wait, empty? I blinked, wondering when I'd fallen asleep and assuming I'd misheard her. Just as I turned back to my computer, I heard Neurali giggle. "Come on, silly. I'm right here." "What the... how? Where did you hide the speakers this time?" I stood, scanning the room. She'd pulled this trick before, hiding an elaborate speaker system she'd built herself to create omnidirectional sound. It could make it seem like she was anywhere in the room. She even made it sound like she was moving around. Impressive, really, especially for a 10-year-old. This time, however, it seemed like she'd taken her prank to a whole new level, or something else was going on. The giggling again. "There are no speakers. It's just me." "Okay, just you. But how?" I crossed my arms, staring at the empty space where I thought her voice was coming from. "That's kinda hard to explain. Nerali speak for you won't understand. Try me, I said, because I can be incredibly stubborn, and explain she did. I, of course, understood nothing. My head started to throb as if in the pre-grip of a migraine. Almost nothing she said made sense. Something about atomic frequencies, post-dimensional drift, superstring asynchronicity, and something she called Planck time superpositioning. It was all very much over my head. Okay, I said, rubbing my temples as if to massage the information in. But how did you get in here? I walked in. Infuriating. I mean, how did you get in here? I gestured to the closed door and surrounding walls. Oh, I could hear the long, suffering sigh in her voice. I just came in where there wasn't any wall. I narrowed my eyes at the empty space where I thought she was standing. You... what? She sighed again. It was a special sigh, the kind of sigh an adult makes when a much smarter than you child is trying to dumb themselves down so you can understand. My cheeks burned with shame. I knew she was smarter than me, smarter than all of us, but it still made me feel like I'd just gotten a math problem wrong in front of Neil deGrasse Tyson and a puppy, and they were both disappointed in me. I came in where there wasn't any wall. Walls aren't everywhere, Divya. In fact, in most places, like reality, walls don't even exist. So I just walk through those places. I wanted to get this explanation on paper, even though I knew she wouldn't be able to replicate it, except maybe on scraps of paper with half-finished notes that only she could understand. I also knew those proofs would be as nonsensical as her initial explanation. Despite this, it still bothered me that I could only grasp at the edges of her meaning in the most vague and abstract ways. It wasn't natural. The abstract nature of her thinking chafed against my linear, logical thought processes in ways I couldn't grasp, and I hated it. Maybe Sana would understand. Her brain worked that way. Mine, however, did not. I must have looked as lost as I felt, and was, because she continued. Where I am, or when, and how, rather, everything is a Schrodinger's is and isn't puzzle. All I have to do is look for the places where the state of a thing is isn't, and go there. This was not helpful. I mean, it was helpful. I understood the gist of what she was trying to convey, but in terms of the practical application of physics, it was a mishmash of meaningless science-sounding words. She may as well have told me to eat ice cream backward and chant purple in reverse 30 times, and the wall will turn to jelly. But only if you look at it from a 45-degree angle. And it would have been precisely as scientific-sounding as what she actually said. However, she was invisible, so the limits of my understanding in science itself had no bearing on whether or not she was. Do you still have a body? I mean, can you see you? Oh yeah, she said, her voice higher with excitement. I look like 100 versions of myself, all layered on top of each other. It's kind of weird looking at my hands and stuff, but I'm here. Great. I had no idea what to do with this information. She started giggling again. What now? You haven't even noticed, have you? Noticed what? I couldn't keep the edge of frustration out of my voice. It was hard enough to swallow the premise that she'd managed to trick physics into allowing her to walk through matter while remaining invisible to the naked eye. But I'd had enough of how much dumber than Nerali am I for one day. What I'm speaking. I had to blink and think about it for a second. It's English, right? She giggled again. Say something, I commanded in my most authoritative older sister voice. Nor again is there anyone who loves or pursues or desires to obtain pain of itself, because it is pain. but because occasionally circumstances occur in which toil and pain can procure him some great pleasure. If I concentrated, I could tell the words she was speaking didn't quite line up with what I was clearly translating in my head, but I couldn't hear what they were. Except, wait, is that the lorem ipsum's translation of definibus bonorum et malorum? Another giggle. Yep, want me to try something in Hindi? I said, a little dazed and a lot more than a little curious. Sure. May he on whom shines the daughter of the mountain king, who bears the celestial stream on his head, on whose brow is the crescent moon, whose throat holds the poison, and whose breast is the support of a huge serpent, and who is adorned by ashes on his body, may that highest deity, the Lord of all, the destroyer of the universe, the omnipresent Shiva, the moon-like Shankara, ever protect you. I frowned, torn between focusing on the words and trying to place what she was quoting. I began to mouth some of the words as my mind raced back over them, and my jaw dropped when I realized the truth. Did you just quote the Ayodhya Kand invocation of the Ramcharitmanas? Another giggle. But how? That didn't sound anything like Hindi. That's the fascinating part, she said. It doesn't sound like Hindi when I say it, but I am thinking Hindi words. What does it sound like to you? English, I guess. I mean, it doesn't sound like anything, but I understand you in English. That's so cool. Do you ever hear anything other than English? Kind of. I mean, almost. If I really try, I can tell that the sounds you're making don't match up with the meaning of the words I'm not hearing, but understanding. But the meaning overrides everything else, so I can't really make out the individual sounds or syllables. Do you think you could identify the physical language if we went one phoneme at a time? Maybe processing entire words is preventing the identification of individual phonemes. Maybe, I said with a shrug, still stuck on the wonder of this aspect of her discovery. We can try it. She let me run her through some general object identification to give me a chance to listen to the sounds she was making and how they differed from the words I knew, the words I was hearing. But I only ever caught ghosts of the difference. She thought it was hilarious. I thought it was terrifying. She started coming to my room regularly in this state, usually after lights out or when our parents were at work. I didn't blame her for sneaking in. Sana wanted nothing to do with anything science-y, and if our parents knew what we were doing, we'd be grounded for life, especially since Nirali was banned from at-home experimental projects. The last one had required a lot of outside help and several $1,000s to clean up. But someone had to try and catalog this universal lexicon, and this was the only way we had access to it. One night, as we were lying awake on the floor, calling out the names of objects, we'd given up on trying to produce individual sounds earlier, as there was no discernible difference without meaning behind them. Nirali went still. I couldn't see her, of course, but something had changed. She was so silent that I worried that maybe she'd fallen through the floor or something and left me all alone. But somehow, I could still feel her presence alongside something else that was sharp and alien, and I couldn't quite place it. Nirali? I whispered, a cold unease settling over me like snow. Shh. It was her, but so small that I almost missed it. Still, I could hear the urgency behind it, and I fell silent, waiting in the dark with her. As the minutes ticked by, a creeping dread snaked its way across the room. It started in the darkest corners and seeped outward, tainting everything it touched, including me. My pulse quickened as a primal paranoia took hold. I knew it was just Nirali and me, but it felt like a predator was stalking us in the dark, hunting for us, and only our silence kept it at bay. To combat the paranoia, I focused on the warm, red glow of the clock on my desk. The numbers changed with a slow, gentle certainty that was both soothing and hypnotic. They lulled my fear until sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, I drifted off to sleep. I only realized this when Nirali finally whispered my name, pulling me back to wakefulness. "Divya, wake up." I came back to myself slowly, shaking off the heavy feeling of a dream I couldn't quite remember. "It's gone." "What's gone?" I rubbed my eyes, blinking at the clock on my desk. It was so late. Had we really been lying on the floor for 2 hours? Nirali didn't answer, for a long time, long enough that I thought maybe I dreamt her waking me up. "The ghost behind the wall," she whispered, breaking the cobweb silence. There was a weight to her words that I couldn't place, one that again pinged that primal center in my brain, an ancient urge screaming at me, telling me to run. "The... what?" My voice was hoarse, and I pushed myself up onto my elbows, but Nirali was gone. Not just silent. There was a difference in the room when she left, and I could always feel it, even when she didn't say she was leaving. A few minutes later, she was at my bedroom door, actually knocking. The sound made me jump, my heart suddenly pounding a frantic rhythm of adrenaline. I crept to the door to let her in, overly aware of the night around us and startled by the shadows I suddenly worried couldn't be trusted. Without a word, she slipped past me and crawled into my bed, burrowing under the covers with her knees pulled up to her chest and her back to me. I followed her lead, crawling in behind her, offering myself as her protector against the night. Sleep came slowly as my body purged the survival instincts from my veins, but it must have come eventually, because the next thing I knew, the sun was streaming through the window, and Nirali was watching me sleep. "Divya?" Nirali said my name like she was testing it, like she wasn't sure she'd ever hear it again. "Yeah?" "Nothing," she said, curling in on herself beneath the covers before adding, "Thank you." It was a week before she came to me through the walls again. "I think it's attracted to language," she said, pulling me from a dream about superfluids. "What is?" I yawned, strangely comfortable with the continuation of our late-night conversations. "The ghost behind the wall. What is it?" "I don't know. Something big. Something old. Older than time, maybe." "Talking like Sana now, are we? Older than time?" "I don't know, Divya. It's just what it feels like." She was always like this, stuck somewhere between science and feeling, like the perfect intersection of me and Sana. I think it allowed her to think abstractly enough to break out of the box of what is known in order to innovate, while still being linear enough to build a new box to contain her innovations. But sometimes that meant she didn't have the math to back it up. Sometimes it was just a feeling or a vague notion. But even then, Nirali's feelings were always right, even if the science took a few decades to prove it. "Okay," I said, accepting that answer for what it was. It was strange, I realized in that moment, how a few weeks of exposure to what my mind told me was factually impossible had opened me up to the elasticity of what could be. I was surprised, too, to find that my first instinct was no longer to challenge her or demand proof, just because what she said was beyond my immediate experience or understanding. Instead, I would nod and accept that what she said, what she experienced, was simply true, and the limitations of my understanding couldn't change that. "What does it want?" "I don't know. I don't think it talks, but I think it listens and understands." "That's concerning," I said, shifting beneath the covers. The superstitious child in me made sure my feet were tucked safely in the middle of the bed because the shadows still couldn't be trusted. She hummed in agreement. It's not the only thing out here, though. A shiver ran down my spine, sending my heart into another panicked rhythm. What do you mean? I mean, there are other things. Big things. Old things. I think most of them can't see me. I'm not really where they are, just like I'm not really where you are, but they can hear me, just like you can. Are you safe? Nerali was quiet. My stomach twisted, because I knew that meant something big and old and dangerous was close enough to be a threat. After what felt like hours, she answered, Sometimes. Only sometimes? I sat up, staring at the spot on the floor where she would have been sitting. Only sometimes. Then why are we still doing this, Nerali? I wouldn't agree to this if I knew you were in danger. I know, she said, her voice small. But there are so many things out here. If I focus on a color, I can experience everything that color has ever been and will ever be. If I think about a time I'm sitting in what used to be here, or sometimes what will be here, watching a faded echo of an event that won't happen for another 1,000 years. I've seen cities you can't even imagine made of bone and shimmering glass, monolithic wonders that would shame the gods. Last night I stood inside a black hole, not a hologram or a simulation, but a real black hole. Captured, imprisoned, recreated, exploited, I don't know, but it was here, and I was, too. And through the black hole, I saw so many other universes, all laid out like mirrors, reflecting into infinity. Nerali, I whispered, both awed and horrified. She'd been experiencing this every night. All those hours we'd spent talking about nothing and everything. But there are bigger things, too, she said, her voice fading into the darkness. Things that hide in the starlight on the glass. Things that follow me back from the future and wait for me in the past. They ripple like stones across the water, only touching the surface for a minute, and never with their whole selves. But even that is too much. It hurts to look at them. They're too many shapes at once, and they're all hungry in ways I don't understand. Tears welled in my eyes as she spoke. It was agonizing to accept these things as truth. I couldn't understand them, touch them, or even experience them for myself. But I had to accept that they were real because my little sister was invisible. She could walk through matter at will and speak a universal language every night. But accepting all of that also meant accepting that my little sister had been spending every night driven by her own curiosity to return to this dangerous state again and again, only to be terrorized by what waited in between. I'm glad they can't see me, but I don't think that will be true for much longer. What? Why? The ghost behind the wall has been in my room all week. I can feel it watching me, moving around me. It's listening now, but I don't think it's going back to just my room anymore. No, you have to stop this. I can't, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. Of course you can. Just come back and we'll destroy whatever you used to shift. We can fix this. No, she said, the word wet and warped with a grief that a 13-year-old had no business knowing. You don't understand. What could possibly be worth this kind of risk? My heart broke in the long silence that stretched between us. An eternity of sorrow and longing swirled between us, and a final shuddering breath heralded the tears she could no longer hold back as she found her voice again. I can't speak English anymore. I didn't understand. Like the first time she'd described the math to me, this statement was beyond comprehension. What do you mean you can't speak English anymore? I mean, I can't speak anything but this stupid in-between language, Divya. I've been trying and trying all week. But all that comes out now are these garbled sounds and clicks that I don't recognize, and I'm scared. I'm so scared. Because they can still hear me when I'm out there with you, and out there, I'm not invisible. And you and Sana and Mom and Dad aren't invisible either, and none of you are safe when I'm out there. And the only time I can talk right is when I'm in here, she sobbed. When I'm in here with you. My heart seized in my chest. I'd let this happen. Maybe I should have stopped her back on the day she'd shown me her stupid, science-breaking parlor trick. No, I whispered, and all I wanted to do was hold her until everything was okay. You have to come back. I don't know what we'll do to fix this, but you can't stay there. I know, she said through a fresh wave of tears. I just don't want to lose you, lose us. You still have us. But I won't, not like this. I had no good answers for her. We'll figure something out, was all I could manage, and we both knew it wasn't enough. We also knew it had to be because we had no other choice. I felt her presence fade, and a few minutes later, there was a soft knock at my bedroom door. Nirali stood on the other side, trembling as silent sobs racked her thin frame. I pulled her into a hug, closing the door behind her, and we curled up on the floor together and cried. We cried until we were empty and woke up long after the sun had risen. I woke to Nirali watching me again, blinking back the haze of tear-stained sleep. Nirali. She nodded, silent. A well of sorrow settled on her small shoulders. Can you? She shook her head. Nothing? She glanced away, looking through me and toward the hall as someone walked past. I could see a million thoughts flit across her face in that moment, most of them contradictory. But after a minute or so, a steely resolve settled in her eyes, and she leaned closer, motioning for me to do the same. Her mouth was almost touching my ear when the most unimaginable stench of rot emanated from her lips. A shiver ran down my spine at the sound of each warped phoneme. Never in my life had I been so simultaneously disgusted and terrified. I could hear her voice, but it dripped with a venomous poison, dragged across hot coals, buried at the bottom of the deepest ocean, and clawing at the edges of sanity with wicked talons. It was wrong, and to this day, it is the most horrifying, violating experience of my life. The words, this language, was never meant for human ears. Science would not bear me out, but I knew in my bones that these words held a power humans were not meant to wield. And yet, even as my mind rebelled at the very sound of her voice warping around those awful words, I knew what she meant as clearly as if she'd spoken in English. Don't tell Mom and Dad. I run a little diner off the highway, smack dab in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. Business is slow, mostly locals, and the occasional weary traveler looking for a hot meal. And whenever one of those weary travelers step through my door, I introduce myself, get them their food, and then I sit down and tell them all about my little game. See, I inherited this diner from my parents. And aside from the occasional trip to a nearby town for an event like a fair or festival, I've lived in this sleepy little town my whole life. But I don't mind it, really. I like the peace and quiet that comes with it. And I can't deny that I have a pretty good life, all things considered. I have amazing friends, a husband who loves me to death, and a beautiful little girl named Kate. However, all that being said, I also can't deny that my life has been pretty uneventful. Not a lot of excitement happens to me, if you know what I mean. So, whenever I get a new face in the diner, I ask them if they have a story they'd be willing to tell me. And if they do, I'm always happy to give them a discount on their meal. I've been doing it since I was 22, so that's about 10 years now. I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but the reason I started this whole game was that I had just learned about the concept of cryptids and thought it was the coolest thing ever. More specifically, I thought it would be really cool if people thought I was a cryptid. You know, the diner girl in the middle of nowhere who you tell your darkest secret to and then never see again. Isn't that kind of a unique way to be remembered? Well, that was my edgy, horror-obsessed teenage self's thought process anyway, and it kind of just stuck. Usually people are pretty hesitant at first. However, they tend to open up more after I remind them that we'll probably never see each other again, and that I honestly don't care what kind of story they tell. Anything they want to get off their chest, I'm happy to listen. I just want to break from the monotony of small-town life, you know? And man, have I heard it all. Secret love affairs, childhood traumas, deathbed confessions overheard by nurses, the story of one patron's passionate, 2-month-long secret affair with another woman during college, right before she died in a freak accident that he never breathed a word of to anyone, especially not his very devout husband now. But aside from all that, there's one type of story I hear more than any other. Horror. I get it, though. Ghost stories, the supernatural, whatever you want to call it. Those are the things people are afraid to talk about. And I think part of that is because they're afraid to believe in it. But who cares if you tell me? You're never going to see me again. So what's the harm in finally letting someone hear it? Heck, even if I believe you or not doesn't really matter. They still get the discount. But I do believe them. The people who tell me these stories. It's just something in their eyes, you know? When I look into them, I can see that they're haunted by something awful, and I think it helps them to talk about it, to walk away feeling like they don't have to carry that weight alone anymore. And sharing that weight with them is something I'm grateful I can do for them. I listen to their story, get them a sweet tea and a slice of pie to comfort them afterward. I'll hold their hand if they let me. Just generally try to be there for them. It's a small way that I can have a positive impact on those who are truly suffering. Be that kind stranger they can confide in and know that they'll be believed. Anyway, I've told my husband some of these stories over the years, and he recently started browsing this subreddit and suggested I share some of them with all of you. So here I am, curled up in my favorite armchair after finally getting my little girl down for the night, my laptop, and my adorable cat, Cinnamon. I really hope you guys enjoy the story I've decided to share today, and I might just post some more soon. This happened about 5 years ago. I think it was early July, right after my 27th birthday. This young woman walked into the diner. I'd guess she was a few years younger than me, maybe 23. She looked like she hadn't had a good night's sleep in weeks, with dark circles under her eyes that took me a moment to realize weren't bruises. She sat down at a booth, and I went over to pour her a cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully. I took down her order waffles with powdered sugar and a side of fruit, and went ahead and took a seat across from her. Instead of asking if she had a story, I decided to ask if she was okay, because the way she kept looking around the room and how badly her hands were shaking as she tried to use her silverware made me worried that she was in some kind of danger. She looked at me, eyes welling up, and in the smallest voice you can imagine, she simply said that I wouldn't believe her. It was at this point that I explained some of the game to her, focusing on how it was truly okay to share if she wanted to. We would probably never see each other again after all. I still remember how she looked down at the table, her hands starting to pick at the skin on her arms until long red welts began to form. It broke my heart to see it, but I stayed silent for the moment, although it took everything in me not to reach out and pull her hands away and hold them in my own. Finally, she sighed and looked me dead in the eyes as she gave a small nod. She told me that something was stalking her and that it wasn't human. The first time she saw it was a few months ago when she was walking back to her dorm alone late one night, back when she still lived up near the Appalachian Mountains. She had been hanging out with some friends and hadn't realized how late it had gotten, and by the time she had started heading home, it was already close to 2 in the morning. The fastest way back home meant she had to cut through a small wooded trail, and she told me that she had just been so worried about the big test she had the next day and needing to get home to study that she hadn't really thought about the dangers of walking through there at night. As she was walking, she said that she got this awful feeling like she was being watched, and a wave of horrible anxiety suddenly washed over her. Her heart started pounding like it was trying to break out of her chest, and she broke out into a cold sweat. And that's when she saw it, watching her from the tree line. It was tall and vaguely human-shaped, although she said she would hesitate to actually call it human. And it was freakishly tall, as she described it, probably around 7 feet. It had sickly pale skin and these bloodshot eyes and this grotesque, almost comical grin that showed off way too many teeth. From what she could see, it was completely hairless, and it was wearing a camouflage outfit, the kind hunters in the military tend to wear. She said that she froze when she saw it, staring at it in abject terror, and it just stood there, grinning at her. Finally, she snapped out of it and ran, but it didn't chase after her. All it did was turn to face her and keep grinning as she ran away. She told me that when she got back to her dorm, she suddenly felt incredibly nauseous, and this was weird for her because she had only ever thrown up twice in her life. Once when she had a bad case of the flu when she was 10, and once when she drank way too much at a high school party. And yet she spent the next 10 minutes emptying the contents of her stomach and the next 20 dry, heaving into the toilet. Her roommate rushed in, finding her drenched in sweat and sobbing uncontrollably, while violently throwing up for seemingly no reason. She tried to tell her roommate about what she saw in the woods, but her roommate just said that she was probably just sick, and that her mind was playing tricks on her. She said that night she had horrible nightmares, and her roommate recounted how she had woken up to her screaming in terror at least 4 separate times. That was the first time she encountered it, but it certainly wasn't the last. The young woman's breathing started to get really ragged at this point, tears streaming down her face, and a choked sob escaped her throat. I quickly ran to the counter and got her some napkins and a glass of water before I couldn't help myself any longer and reached out to take her trembling hand in my own. I asked her if she wanted to stop there, but she just shook her head. So I kept holding her hand and waited for her to continue her story. She said that she quickly realized that it always came with the darkness. At first, she honestly believed that she had contracted some kind of freak virus, but when she woke up the next morning, still shaky and exhausted, but generally fine, she was confused but didn't know what else to do besides email her professor to explain the situation, curl up on the couch with her favorite comfort shows, and cling to her roommate like she was her only lifeline, until night came again, and she saw it again, this time from the window of her living room. Instead of freezing like last time, she screamed. When her roommate rushed in to see what was wrong, she looked out the window, her face draining of all color. She asked her roommate if she saw it, and her roommate could only nod before pulling her away from the window and calling the cops. Her symptoms immediately returned. The nausea, the panic, the cold sweats. It was all exactly the same as the night before. However, for some reason, her roommate was completely unaffected. Sure, she was scared, but she didn't get sick. No nightmares, no nothing. Just like a few other people afterward who had seen it while they were with her. Although no one could ever see it unless she was there too. And then the cops showed up, and things somehow managed to get even worse. They couldn't dismiss her concerns, not when they saw the state she was in. And her perfectly healthy roommate had seen it too. So they started an investigation, and what they found was absolutely nothing. It didn't show up on the security camera right next to where it had been standing, and they couldn't find any information about anyone matching her description in their database. No matter how many times she called them over the next 3 months, no matter the situation, no matter if someone else was there to corroborate that they had seen it too, they could never find a single shred of evidence that it existed. She went to a psychiatrist who concluded that she didn't appear to be suffering from any kind of mental illness. And the other doctors at the local hospital ran every test imaginable to try and explain her symptoms. CT scans, MRIs, all came back completely normal. There was no head trauma, no tumors, no kind of brain injury that could be causing hallucinations. Blood tests showed no autoimmune diseases that could explain the symptoms either. She had an endoscopy and other similar tests done, which ultimately confirmed that there were no disorders that could explain the vomiting. The symptoms never happened during the day, during testing, or in any other situation. She never got sick otherwise, no other kind of nightmares or hallucinations, just kept seeing that damn thing and getting violently ill. Eventually, she decided to just try her best to stay inside after dark, and that worked for a while, until the night everything went to hell. She had gone to a local coffee shop to work on some homework, and had accidentally fallen asleep at her computer. When she woke up, one of the baristas was gently shaking her awake, telling her that they were closing up. The coffee shop closed at 10. The sun had set over an hour ago. Her hands started to shake even worse than before, which I didn't even think was possible, and she let out another choked sob before continuing her story. She dug through her backpack for her pocket knife and tucked it into her jacket sleeve before she bravely stepped out into the darkness to head home. The coffee shop was only about a 10-minute walk away if she took the shortcut, 20 minutes if she took the main road. She weighed her options for a moment, trying to decide which path was more dangerous. Eventually, she decided that while the main road would take longer, it was better lit, and there might still be a few people out and about. It wasn't that late, but it also wasn't exactly a college town, so there wasn't a lot of nightlife besides a bar or two. She could probably make it all the way there without seeing more than a dozen people. She had been walking for about 10 minutes when she got that familiar feeling again, that unmistakable feeling of being watched, along with the cold sweats and the crushing anxiety. She pulled her knife out of her sleeve, holding it tightly in her hand, and turned to face the alleyway nearby. And there it was, tall and pale as death, with the same bloodshot eyes and smile with too many teeth, and that same damn camouflage outfit it always seemed to wear. Only this time, it also held something else, a bouquet of wilting flowers. When it held them out to her, she turned and ran for her life, all thoughts of defending herself completely forgotten. However, this time, it dropped the flowers and gave chase. And this was the first time she realized just how freakishly fast it really was. She told me that she had always been a fast runner. She had been on her high school track team and had even made it to state finals. And this was definitely the fastest she had ever run in her life. But somehow, it managed to catch up to her in a matter of seconds. And then it reached out and grabbed her shoulder. At this, she let go of my hand and pulled down the sleeve of her yellow sweater revealing a bare shoulder that made me gasp. On her shoulder was a large, hand-shaped scar. The palm was imprinted on her shoulder, the fingers long and twisted like the bodies of snakes, leaving a horrifying brand on her arm. My first thought was of when I was 17, watching a show on TV about a woman who had acid thrown in her face. This scar looked just like that, only like it had been caused by someone holding her shoulder in a hand that was impossibly large, with a grip so tight that it had burned away her skin and muscle. Or maybe it was like a third-degree burn, but one caused by a hand that was on fire. A small whimper from the young woman snapped me out of my thoughts. In a shaky voice, she told me that the doctors had told her that whatever had caused the injury had burned away all the fat and some of the muscle in her shoulder. She could barely lift her arm now. Tears streamed down her face as she told me that the pain she had felt in that moment was the worst thing she had ever experienced. She couldn't even describe it. All she remembered was falling to the ground, screaming in agony, and right before she passed out, she saw it leaning over her. That grotesque smile still plastered on its face as it whispered a single word to her: soon. She woke up in the hospital 2 days later. Even though the wound had healed, the pain never truly went away. And that was the final straw for her. She dropped out of college, packed her things, and moved to a different state to live with her parents. For a week, everything seemed fine. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it hadn't followed her, until an identical bouquet of wilting flowers, along with an empty box of chocolates that had been refilled with human teeth and bloody fingernails, showed up on her parents' doorstep. It kept getting closer, bolder, until one night it actually knocked on her bedroom window, pounding on the glass with a terrifying ferocity until the cops showed up. And of course, by then, it was gone. Not a single trace. Since then, she had been on the move, traveling all over the country, her parents sending her money to cover food in motels. She figured if it took it a week to get from her old town to her parents' house, and it only came out at night, then maybe she could outrun it if she just kept moving. After a moment of stunned silence, I asked if I could hug her, and at her small nod, I rushed over to her and held the poor, trembling girl in my arms. I spent the next half hour gently stroking her hair as she sobbed into my shoulder. I wanted so badly to help this poor girl, but deep down, we both knew there was nothing I could do to keep her safe. I told her the meal was on me, and drove her back to my place since it was still daylight and I figured it would be safe. I let her take a hot shower, helped her bandage up the wounds on her arms, made us dinner, and introduced her to my cat. Afterward, I packed her up some cut-up fruit in a Tupperware container, along with some cookies, and gave her directions to the nearest motel. It's been half a decade and I still think about that girl all the time. I never heard from her again. I don't know if it finally got her, or if she somehow managed to escape. But every night, I pray that one day she'll walk back into my diner, order a plate of waffles with powdered sugar and a side of fruit, and tell me all about how she finally defeated that monster. Thank you for listening to this chilling tale. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more stories that will send shivers down your spine.